Hi everyone, I'm a local government official who used to deal with climate change in eThekwini Municipality in Durban. I've more recently moved into a position that sees me overseeing the sustainability and resilience work of the city, so really building out on that previous biodiversity and climate change work. I also hold the title of Chief Resilience Officer for the city of Durban as part of our participation in an international program looking at developing resilience in urban areas. And I suppose my night job is as a co-chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the 6th Assessment Report, and I'm co-chair of Working Group 2, and our job is to oversee the assessment of the impacts, adaptation and vulnerability aspects of climate change science, and we'll be producing our main assessment report through 2015 all the way through to 2022. So I wear a number of hats and I cover a number of scales of intervention in the urban environmental management, governance, climate change space. I've been told that the format for this session will be a brief input from myself, and then we'll be taking questions and I'll be attempting to find good answers to those questions for the remainder of the session. So given my predominant interest in issues around climate change and knowing that the video that was circulated to you prior to the commencement of the session had myself and Irma talking about governance issues, I thought I might open up our conversation this afternoon with some reflections on issues related to climate change governance and the scales at which we as local government practitioners now have to operate. And I always find it's most useful to draw on very practical experiences. So in effect, I'm going to talk to you about my experiences today and what I did today in that regard. So I started off this morning talking to one of the support committees for our city council about some of the work that we're doing in the resilience space, where we're focusing in on issues of informal settlements and looking at ways to approach the upgrading of informal areas in our city in a way that's sustainable, resilient, but also climate smart. So really the nitty-gritty of dealing with councillors, their queries around what informality is, how one might approach it, what sort of partnerships we might be looking at, a very fine level of detail. And then sort of ending off my afternoon just before I started speaking to you, really engaging with some of my IPCC colleagues around a major climate change conference that the IPCC will be co-hosting next year in March, where the big agenda is to develop between the scientific practitioner and policy community a new research roadmap looking at cities and climate change science. And so that very high level of governance is where I ended up with the day. And I think that's the challenge that many of us who work at the local level are beginning to face now. We're called on to know our cities, to understand how we approach the climate change challenges of our cities in a reasonable amount of detail, being able to drive through processes that secure political support for climate change work, and yet at the same time, we're increasingly being called on not only to work in the local arena, but really to engage in various national and international processes in order to take our message forward. And this is a pattern that we found repeated many times here in Durban. A good example was the fact that Durban is one of the few cities around the world which has led its climate change work with a very strong focus on adaptation. If you look at the history of urban climate change responses, mitigation has generally been the priority for most cities. But as I say, Durban, being a vulnerable African city, has really prioritized with issues related to adaptation. And we beavered away doing a lot of really excellent work at the community level, focusing on issues of ecosystem-based adaptation, so using our important biodiversity as an important adaptation tool, but also as a mechanism to create jobs for our poor and peripheral communities. As we sort of looked up from that very detailed local work, we began to realize that the national and international narrative wasn't in support of our work. It was very strongly mitigation focused, and there was really no lock-in, no plug and play between our local adaptation work and the bigger narrative that was occurring at the national and international levels. So we were very lucky in Durban. We had the opportunity to host the COP 17 in 2011. And we used that opportunity as a host city for the climate change negotiations to work with a number of national and international partners to put together a local government convention, which we ran alongside the COP and which really allowed us to raise the issue of the importance of local government, obviously in the climate change response at the global level, but really hone in on the importance of adaptation, particularly for a continent like Africa and in African cities where the level of risk and vulnerability are so high. That process led to the development of the Durban Adaptation Charter, and that resulted in I and a colleague of mine spending several years between the COP in Durban and the COP in Paris, traveling around the world, really trying to draw attention to the Durban Adaptation Charter. Strong support was signed by over 1,000 cities and their representatives to get adaptation on the agenda for Paris. We had to take some tough decisions in making that call to take the charter forward and to lobby internationally around an increased profile for adaptation governance, because that meant compromising on the local work. And I think, you know, because we have such limited time and resources, that's often a tension that we, as people working at the local government level, are going to face. We've got to span these levels of climate change governance. We've got to be working locally, improving the lives for people in our city, reducing risk in our city, but at the same time, we're being increasingly called on to be involved and, in fact, to be active lobbyists at the national and international level. And the question is, how do we develop the resources and skill sets that allow us to cross that very large spectrum of action? I think we already have some questions, so before I get too behind, I'm going to pick up on the first question. The first question is from Sandhya Chandrashek, and the question goes as follows: as most city governance occurs within 20th century bureaucratic structures and follows deeply entrenched rules and procedures working in silos, how has 21st century sustainable development goal-oriented thinking enabled you to really permeate them? Could you give some very specific and concrete examples from your work in South Africa? Do you think it is transferable to other contexts? Really interesting question there. You know, how do we marry essentially 20th century institutions with the new drives we see in 21st century policy? So the SDGs, the New Urban Agenda, and the Paris Agreement. Sorry. I think very often it's going to depend on people more than positions and structures. I think what we've got to be able to do is to develop compelling arguments that draw on local experience and identify with, because I think the big challenge is, you know, if you talk about the SDGs to many local politicians, you know, goals such as life underwater or addressing poverty, these are things that remain quite abstract and which you can draw them down into real life examples that allow them to understand why a more sustainable development path is appropriate. And so to give a real life example that we've had in Durban, sorry, I'm still battling the flu, we've used very large reforestation projects as experiments. So we've done some urban tinkering and experimentation, drawing poor communities into the reforestation process, allowing them to create opportunities for socio-economic improvement, as well as improving biodiversity in catchment areas to secure water supply, and have been able to take leadership and councillors out to real life projects where they can see poor people working, they can see improved biodiversity, they can see cost-effective catchment management, and thereby able to demonstrate that a SDG focused on cities or focused on waters is in fact a valid one because it improves the quality of life in cities. I have a second question here from Noel. You mentioned in the discussion that sustainability initially was viewed in competition with major development initiatives. How is it now, and could you give examples from your experience mainstreamed into development? Noel, thanks very much for that particular question. I think it's really important, particularly for those of us who work at the local level, is not to lull ourselves into a sense of complacency, to think that because the policy framework has changed at an international, indeed even national level, that potentially has resulted in all the problems mysteriously disappearing at the local level. And the local level is always going to be a place where we deal with both edges of the sword. It's the sharp edge of decision making. Real decisions have to be made that impact on real development pathways, that impact on real people. So some of the tougher questions are always going to land in the local space. And certainly we are still seeing, despite the major policy changes, the fact that development and potentially sustainability are seen as being in opposition to one another, that one can't have development with sustainability. And I go back to my reply to the previous question. I think the only way of breaking that particular do loop or that self-reinforcing cycle is through a process of experimentation, of being able to demonstrate that there are different opportunities in terms of development that can embrace sustainability principles, still meet people's needs, and yet take us forward from a sustainability perspective. I think the big challenge that we face in that regard is that there's no one unified set of answers, no one unified set of urban experiments that are going to allow us to demonstrate this, because the big challenge for those of us working in cities in the 21st century is the fact that the future is largely unpredictable, it's largely unknowable, and so your process of urban experimentation has to be ongoing. We can't rest on our laurels. So, for example, in the case that I gave of our reforestation work, where we were desiring to improve our adaptive capacity to climate change and reduce biodiversity loss through reforesting some of our catchment areas and thereby creating jobs for poor and marginalized communities, acknowledging that poverty is one of the greatest risks under climate change conditions. That experiment was very successful. However, it's raised really challenging questions, because within the context of that particular experiment, we got lots of people involved in local communities. But once a forest is built, you can employ some people in the community in managing the forest. But the question is, having built the skills in the remainder of the community, having offered them environmental training, business skills training, where do they go to from there? So what is the next step in the green economy that allows you to transition people from the entry-level involvement in the major reforestation programs into other elements of the value chain associated with the green economy? And this is a piece that we are still missing, is how do we move people through a new pattern of green economy? And that then begins to raise questions around, well, what is the focus of economic development if there's a strong priority around the green economy? Does that change the principles we look at? And in fact, today, going back to my experiences of today, I've just been liaising with a colleague in our economic development department who's very keen to change the rules of the game on how we see economic development in the city, to move to an economy focused on well-being as opposed to GDP. And so again, we can see that the work of the local government practitioner really isn't so much anymore about pipes and overlaid head power pylons, but it's about experimentation, it's about learning, it's about changing patterns of governance, it's about testing new elements of ideology. And so that really relies on brave, strong people to be able to marry these very disparate agendas together. I have a third question from Wang Yu. Can you talk a little bit about how you deal with conflict of ecosystem-based adaptation with other sectors, such as housing and transportation? Thanks very much for that question. Durban is, I suppose, fortunate in that we've had 3 decades of dealing with issues of ecosystem-based adaptation, by virtue of the fact that our city is located in a global biodiversity hotspot. So we've got 36 areas around the world which have very high biodiversity, but also under tremendous threat. So Durban has a long history in trying to figure out how we incorporate biodiversity into the planning and management of a rapidly expanding African city. And I think, Wang Yu, as you're implying in your question, that's often going to lead to a clash of visions, development and potentially biodiversity conservation, meeting each other in conflictual situations. And there have been a number of responses that we've employed to try and diffuse the situation. The first of these is to demonstrate the value of a biodiversity or ecosystem-based approach to risk management to politicians. And the first tool we used in that regard was one of resource economics. So the process of actually placing a value on the ecosystem services that are delivered by our biodiversity. And that was really very successful in changing the political narrative, because the ecosystems in the city went from something that could be deemed to be nice to have but not essential to being understood as ecological infrastructure, as important as pipes that carry water and electricity, that power lines that carry energy. So that was an important step forward, but in and of itself would not have been sufficient. Having utilized that tool, we also began to see changes in national level legislation. So this speaks to the importance of vertical integration in the management of our cities. We not only need to be doing urban experimentation, pushing the boundaries locally, but we need to be seeing other spheres. We saw in South Africa a change in our legislative environment, which ensured that biodiversity should be protected and placed that responsibility to at the feet of local government. And so we were able to not only demonstrate the value of ecosystem-based approaches, but also indicate that it was required by law. The third particular tool that we've used is one of science, and science, I believe, is becoming more important on a day-to-day basis in the way we think about and plan and manage our cities. So we've used the process of systematic conservation assessment to say, well, if you place great value on the services that come from ecosystems and you're required by law to protect them, we need to be able to figure out how big and where those ecosystems need to be in order to provide the services back to the residents of our city to be able to reduce risk from things like climate change. And that process of systematic conservation assessment, where we've worked in partnership with our local university as well to extend our understanding of the relationship between biodiversity and climate change, has become a very powerful tool again in helping us lock in the biodiversity requirements into our plans. So as I say, it's a multi-pronged attack, it's complex, and this is work that's really taken decades. Rashimi, thanks for your question. What are the provisions available, let's say the Paris Agreement, for citizens to stop governments from using reserved lands, which are currently forests and lakes? Thanks, Rashimi, for that particular question. We must remember that the Paris Agreement is an agreement between national governments. So it's not the sort of agreement that's going to empower citizens directly in law or by policy. And even if you look at the Paris Agreement itself, the requirements to produce NDCs is in fact the only really legally binding part of that agreement. What is important about the Paris Agreement, though, is it does set up the architecture for the global discussion around how we move forward on climate change. The more direct route for citizens to be active in their countries would be to look at their nationally determined contributions, or the NDCs. So those are the vehicles by which countries commit to the Paris Agreement, and on a 5-year rotation, raise their level of ambition in terms of the actions they will take to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. I would imagine in most countries that NDC, and we certainly see it happening in South Africa, is developed in consultation with stakeholders from around the country. So it'd be through that kind of consultative process that stakeholders at the local level should be able to interact with their national governments around the broad principles of the NDCs, and, for example, raise the importance of ecosystem-based adaptation within the NDCs commitments. And if we look at some of the NDCs that have, in fact, been offered up, we see that there are a focus on adaptation. Many of them have a very strong focus on mitigation, but we are seeing NDCs with increasingly strong commitments to adaptation and the acknowledgement of things like ecosystem-based adaptation. So I would imagine that's probably the best way to intervene, given that the Paris Agreement is an international agreement between nations. So it was not destined to speak to the individual, even though it acknowledges the importance of non-party stakeholders. So we have to find the appropriate level of intervention for the individual to interact, because some platforms are not necessarily set up for the individual. I've got a next question from a government employee, Francis Ray Quintana. If I'm going to review climate change reports in hopes of applying solutions for 2017 onwards, how far back do I have to study? Publication 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Considering climate change, science models age or change or get outdated, are there any obsolete systems theories, climate models, or frameworks? Francis, this is where I now sort of take off my local government hat and put on my IPCC co-chair hat. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Programme, precisely to ensure a regular pipeline of information to the policymakers about climate change science, so that we as people sitting at the local government level don't have to worry about which models are obsolete, what science is not up to scratch. So I would say that your most reliable source of scientific information comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's key reports. We've currently got the 5th assessment report available to us. That comes in 3 volumes, one which deals with the physical science, which will tell you everything you need to know about the models, one which deals with the issues of adaptation, one that deals with mitigation. So those are important baseline sources, and you'll see in the bibliographies that accompany each chapter references to all of the key papers. So again, good guidance to where you should be looking if you have the desire to go back to the original scientific research, which is reflected in the assessment. We are working on the 6th assessment report, and it's a very busy assessment cycle for us, in that not only will we be producing the 6th assessment, which will appear in those 3 volumes, so an updated one on physical science, adaptation, and mitigation, but we're also producing 3 special reports. The first of those will deal with the issue of global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. You'll know that that was a potentially increased level of ambition that was reflected in the Paris Agreement, and the IPCC has been asked to look at the feasibility and ability to meet such a goal. So that will provide you information. We're also going to have a special report on oceans and cryosphere, because this is a key area of interaction. The oceans and the ice sheets are key determinants of our future, and of course we know most of us live in coastal cities, so particularly important there. We've got a 3rd special report on the issues of land. So we're going to be producing those reports beginning next year in 2018, virtually on an annual basis. The 1.5 report will come out in 2018, 2019. You'll see the special report on oceans and cryosphere and land, and then in from 2020 through to 2022, you're going to start seeing the main assessment reports come out. So that really would be your go-to for scientific information. Leslie, you said science must include both physical and social sciences. How is Durban engaging with social sciences in the context of climate change? Thanks, Leslie, very much for that particular question. I think certainly as a local government practitioner who trained as a natural scientist, it's not a natural go-to to be able to incorporate social sciences in the work that we do. And so we've acknowledged we need a diversity of partners to enable us to understand the social sciences better and to be able to incorporate those more effectively in our work. And we've done that by putting in place research partnerships with our local university, where as part of that process and other international projects, we've been able to draw skilled social sciences from scientists from that community into our work. I think the arena where they are probably most active at this point is in our resilience work. And there they've been really key in helping us understand two of the big resilience issues that we face in Durban. When we worked with our stakeholders and said, look, you know, not only does the city have to be sustainable and climate smart and protect its biodiversity, but given the fact that we're facing this very unpredictable future, resilience is an important issue for us, the ability to deal with change. We have landed in two areas where Durbanites feel that, you know, that change probably brings the most risk and the most opportunity, one of informal settlements upgrading, and the other dealing with the interaction between our municipal form of governance and our traditional forms of governance. And there the social scientists have been very useful in helping us understand the dynamics of informal settlements, who the key players are, what some of the really tasty issues are in those environments, and also enabling us to really understand the complex governance framework which is associated with traditional land tenure, which is an issue that many African cities have to deal with. And so we literally find ourselves working hand in hand, and in fact our resilience strategy, which we'll release over the next couple of weeks, comes out with a thought piece at the front of the strategy, which has been drafted by some social scientists and ourselves, reflecting on these bigger social issues in order to give them adequate profiles. So our key involvement with the social sciences has been through these partnerships and bringing that skill set on board so it can help us adjudicate the kind of work we need to do and help us prioritize where we intervene with our work. Rockefeller, you speak quite strongly about the need for science in informing decision-making. Are political decision-makers receptive of the key message coming from science? Thanks, Rockefeller, for that particular question. I think they're increasingly receptive. I certainly wouldn't say that we've bowled them over with science. The political environment is just not that amenable to science currently. But I think where we can link the science with that full value chain. So I've spoken before in this session about the need for urban tinkering and experimentation. You know, if we can tie that process up with scientific methodology, which allows us to demonstrate benefit, but also to provide frameworks for clearer decision making. Because often decision makers and politicians are in the invidious position of having to take the big decisions that none of us really want to deal with. And so science can be a very helpful decision support tool. It can be a very helpful tool in enabling us to better monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of our implementation interventions to determine whether we're on the right path or not. It can move us past the point of just urban legend in relation to some issues by getting some data and information down, which allows us to be more effective decision makers. And certainly where we found that where we use science in that support role, so not as an overarching ethos or ideology that we have to bow our knees to, but something that acts in support of difficult decision making, we've seen an increasingly amenable political mind. That's not to say that all the problems have gone away, and certainly there is constant contestation. But I think that's just part of a a maturation process whereby science was really never seen as part of what local government does. We've introduced it, and it's like a good wine. You know, when you put it on the shelf, it's got to be on that shelf for a while before it matures and develops a certain bouquet that is pleasing to the nose. And certainly introducing science at the local government level requires that process of normalization and maturation within the system. So really the onus on us is, as practitioners in the field, to be bringing that to politicians, how it's helpful, how it helps them in their decision making, and how it can help them make big decisions and track the consequences of those decisions going forward. Vanshi Shah, we know that there are impacts of urban development on urban water bodies, climate change impacts on urban water bodies too. Is there a way in which a synergistic impact of both may be studied? I'm certainly not a water person, but what we've been doing in Durban, again, because water is such a key element in the city, so we're an African city, all African cities, or certainly most have water problems. We live on a very dry continent, is thinking about how we approach the more holistic management of our water supply in a way that allows us to reduce the risk that will come from climate change. And so again, and this comes back to where I started this discussion today, this issue of governance. You know, we've long ago passed the point where local government can deal with these problems by itself. And so we've put in place a very large catchment-wide partnership which extends beyond our municipal boundaries. It involves our neighboring municipalities, also involves a number of research institutions, a number of non-governmental organizations, in order to be able to begin modeling catchments at the kind of level that allows us to determine, you know, how climate change might impact on water supply, what the appropriate response might be at a catchment level, and then most importantly for those of us who work at the local level, how one might begin to fund such interventions. So if we acknowledge, for example, that protecting wetlands in our upper catchments is an important part of minimizing risk on water bodies, both through pollution but also through things like climate change, then how do we ensure the longevity of those particular landscape elements? You know, what are the costs? Can we change the tariff systems to generate alternative flows of funding, which will allow those areas to be better managed? In many of our upper catchments, we've got high levels of agriculture, which obviously have impacts on water bodies, not in terms of extraction, but also in terms of water quality from fertilizers. So can we put in place a funding system where landowners are in fact paid to farm water as opposed to farm crops? And if we do make those kind of land use changes, what are the secondary impacts of that? So, you know, would that impact on issues like food production and food security? So again, our approach has been getting many people around the table with many skill sets, be that government, research, environmental NGOs, community stakeholder groups, to best try and understand these systems and understand what our societal priorities are in the face of things like climate change, and then determine how we jointly go forward in managing them. Hashimi, your question: how is the land, which is already occupied in most urban areas, being brought into the scope of planning for climate change mitigation work, like the Buffels Drive project in Durban? Rashimi, thanks for that question. You know, I think there are a variety of potential land uses in cities. In the case of the Buffels Drive scenario, what we had was a regional landfill site, which was required by law. So the environmental authorization for that site required an 800-meter, virtually a kilometer wide buffer around that site to be instituted to protect surrounding communities from any potential adverse health impacts from the site. So that buffer area provided us with a great opportunity to rebuild the forest that would have occurred in that area. So that land was, fortunately for us, under sugarcane and fairly low levels of productivity in those fields. So the move from cane land into a forest was relatively easy. In our other reforestation projects, again, we've been moving or working in areas where there hasn't been a contesting land use. So I think that's there's getters, have we worked in areas where there's been another land use? In one instance, yes, there was cane, but again, that was a very easy intervention because we were required by law to keep the buffer open and could negotiate with the cane farmers, and it wasn't a particularly productive site. So I think this is something you've got to take on a case-by-case basis. You need to look at the sites in question. You need to look at who the landowners are. The Buffels dry site was easier for us because we were the landowners as the municipality. If there was a private landowner, that certainly would be more difficult. But again, I think this would be something you would need to engage with on a site-by-site basis. Mokshika Chopra, question number 10. What could be affordable economic ways to deal with climate change issues in a developing country? Mokshika, I think the big thing that faces us as developing countries, particularly in this very extended period of economic recession, massive unemployment. I know certainly in South Africa, we've not replaced all the jobs we've lost after the 2008 crash. We've got to be able to tie climate change interventions with opportunities for economic development or human upliftment. So we've got to be able to create a virtuous cycle whereby the climate change intervention has co-benefits for society across that broad range of interventions. As I say, going back to the reforestation project that I've just been speaking about, the co-benefit there was that we were very directly able to create jobs for poor and marginalized communities, and particularly for elements in those communities, so women and children, who are generally excluded from the formal economy. So we provided an alternative to this. Examples from a political point of view was a mother who's been one of the key people involved in our reforestation work, who through the process of being involved in that has literally been able to build a house for her family for the first time, and has been able to send her young girl children to better schools. And so I think it's only by creating real live examples to show that there's real benefit from investing municipal funds in this sort of work, or private funds as the case may be, that we're going to be able to create a reasonable economy that favors investment in climate change adaptation. And that's really important because I think many of us in the developing world come from societies where we have a very high tolerance for risk. And so if you want to talk about investing more funds, particularly in conditions where those funds are extremely limited and there are many pressures requiring those funds to be spent in many diverse places, we're going to have to be able to demonstrate the co-benefits. And I think that's the only way forward. Certainly that's been our experience. Asha, how do you engage local communities with the SDGs when they are distracted by daily needs and priorities? I suppose, Asha, it goes back to some of my previous commentary, is we as local practitioners have to be the translators of the SDGs into local action. So I think the responsibility is on our shoulders to take those 17 SDGs and begin to figure out what they might mean in our context, and begin to be able to drive processes, often small experimental pilot processes, which show how moving in that broad direction of sustainability across those 17 facets that are highlighted in SDGs can actually develop co-benefits that are important to people, and in fact not only develop co-benefits but open up new opportunities. So I've mentioned before something like the green economy. We can see, for example, in China, the huge economic boom that China has experienced from going the renewable energy route and really maximizing its manufacturing base in that regard. So we're not only talking about co-benefits here from a human upliftment and economic point of view, but potential opportunities. But again, You know, it's going to rely on people to figure out what that means in your locale. And that's why local practitioners are so important, because you become the translator of that universal sustainability and resilience message into the local vernacular, into the local development vernacular. And so that's an enormous responsibility that we are placing on the shoulders of local actors, is to become that translation mechanism, which allows us to take sort of quite conceptual and high level aspirations and really lock them down into make those linkages. You know, the SDGs will literally remain sort of words on a piece of paper and won't translate into meaningful action. So again, strong priority on the role of local practitioners, local stakeholders, local activists, requiring us all to work not only locally but across all of these scales of intervention to get our message across. So, you know, that for me is the big question, is really how do we help support the local actor in a way that allows them to meet all of these new high-level aspirations that have literally landed in all of our laps since 2015. Enrique Condona, which metrics or statistics are prioritized for the consideration of cities redevelopment for climate change integration? Again, Enrique, you know, I think that depends on the city. So certainly if one starts at the fairly high level and we reference the SDG on climate, those are fairly generic sort of commitments to take on board climate change, to implement appropriate tools like the Paris Agreement. But we're increasingly finding that the metrics we've got to use at the local level really are context specific. So, for example, as I say, being a high-risk African city, for us, adaptation was really important. And the fact that we're located in a biodiversity hotspot meant that ecosystem-based adaptation was going to be a key concern for us. So we've got a very strong concern about developing metrics that track the ability of ecosystems to reduce risk, and that also track the impact of climate change on those ecosystems if they are going to be a key element that we use in our adaptation response. And so you get that very specific local set of metrics. And again, that can only come from discussions with stakeholders. The stakeholders have to decide what element of risk they're prepared to accept from a climate change point of view. The SDGs are not going to provide that. They're going to have to decide what their responses are going to be, and what kind of resources they're prepared to put behind those responses. And again, all of those decisions will impact on the sort of metrics that you use to track your progress. And that for me is the big challenge. While certainly things like the SDG and the Paris Agreement all get us out of the starting blocks, so they get us heading the right kind of direction, they don't dictate what sort of race we are going to run. And every single city is going to run a different race at a different pace. Different running at the end of the climate change race is going to be different for everyone who ran that race. And so I'm certainly not a big fan of this idea that we're going to have global metrics. I am a much bigger fan of the fact that we're going to have local metrics linked to local policies and actions. Faith Sternleap, it seems that the SDGs are not the most conducive way to measure local urban progress, especially in minimizing impacts of climate change. What are other ways to measure progress on climate change? Well, Faith, I think that probably links back to the reply that I've just given Enrique, is that, you know, I think we've got to understand this environmental governance at a variety of levels. The SDGs are useful, but what are they useful at? They exactly like the Paris Agreement. They're an agreement between nations. So the role of those international agreements and the nation states is to give us general direction about where we want to go. So it's fairly obvious that in terms of that general direction, it's going to set us on a path, but it's not going to speak to the local level of detail that we need to plan and manage our cities. So Again, and this is where I caution people, don't think that there's going to be a recipe book. Don't think that there is someone around the world who's going to be able at some point to arrive in your office or wherever it is that you work, and deliver a set of beautifully tailored indicators or metrics of progress. That's not going to happen. There is no silver bullet. Those context-specific indicators of what we deem to be progress or lack of success are going to have to come from local conversations, which means we're going to have new patterns of local governance that allow us to draw many people to the table so that we can jointly agree on, as urban societies in different parts of the world, what our aspirations are in terms of climate change response, how we're prepared to act, and what kind of process we believe would be appropriate to put in place to monitor and keep us accountable around those kinds of commitments. So again, unfortunately, I wish I could tell everyone who worked in cities that there is a secret handbook which has all these wonderful tailor-made metrics in it. It's unfortunately not the case in my experience, and that really falls to each of us working at the local level to develop context-specific metrics that are supportive of the bigger frameworks, so the SDGs and Paris Agreement, New Urban Agenda, but really pull in the level of detailed concerns that are inherent in the day-to-day operation and planning of our cities. Leslie, how can cities in the Global South build the kind of capacity they need, so highly qualified local government staff, to be able to govern complex climate change adaptation issues like ecosystem-based adaptation? Yeah, it's a tough one, Leslie, and it's something we have had to deal with certainly over the last couple of decades as the city I live and work in, Durban, has moved through a process of democratization in South Africa and essentially building a new form of local government. I can certainly tell you that when I was hired, the people who hired me had no great aspiration of having science influence what the city did, but certainly in my old department, when I left it last year, we had a team of approximately 40 scientifically trained people working on climate change adaptation and biodiversity. And how did we get there? Well, number one, by demonstrating the value of science in decision making. So drawing science into the processes of local government. How did we access that science initially? Well, by forming partnerships with a variety of people who had those scientific skills, both at the university level, but in other institutions, in order to be able to demonstrate the value add of having science in that particular mix. The problem is once you create a market for science in the planning process in cities, it becomes quite difficult to find people who've got a scientific training that can then feed and fill the posts that you create. And so essentially what we've done is we've created a long-term research partnership with our local university, where one of the objectives of that partnership is to provide the scientific data we need in our biodiversity and climate change work, so we can take that on board. But secondly, and equally importantly, is to create the production line of young scientists that we will eventually draw into our system, both at a municipal level and in other organizations in the city, to undertake the scientific work that needs to be done. So we've literally had to create the mechanism that produces the scientists. That's required local government to invest finances in building out that research partnership, to fund the research and training at the university to create the people that we needed. But in doing that, we found that we still weren't getting enough people coming through the system with those high skills base. And so now we've done some more urban tinkering and urban experimentation, in the sense that we're now moving into local schools. So going into communities that are previously disadvantaged. And again, putting municipal money behind a program, testing out whether we can get young school kids, bright promising ones, draw them into the sciences, and hopefully if we're able to get them through their latter years of their schooling successfully, send them through our research partnership at the university. So we're literally creating our production line of young scientists, but that has required a research partnership and commitment of resources from local government to the local university, and indeed now local NGOs to help us with schools level intervention. Francis Ray Quintana, many businesses are championing share economies or Uberization. What are the risks or opportunities that these sharing economies pose for climate resilience in local government? You know, and I think, Francis, a great question. I think that's one of the big problems we are facing going forward, is we don't fully understand what some of the consequences of our responses to this growing basket of challenges that we face in the 21st century might be. So, for example, I was at a meeting recently where we were talking about this role of the autonomous vehicle in the city of the 21st century, with some people seeing it as a real boon, getting us all out of our cars, allowing us greater freedom, can work on the way to work, be able to build a sense of community by traveling with people, getting to work or going to social functions. But on the other hand, also the potential of a city in which you have a total proliferation of autonomous vehicles driving around empty, clogging up roads, and in fact making congestion worse. And I think that's the problem. We exist in a time where the challenges that cities face are really, I think, sort of well termed as wicked problems. They are problems to which there is no easy and obvious solution. And so under those sets of circumstances, while we might respond, we're not entirely certain what the consequences are. So certainly things like the green economy, the shared economy, these look useful. And if you look to cities such as Bristol, where they've got their own currency, so things like the Bristol pound, and they've got a shared economy based on bartering and trading around this new currency, there seems to be great value in improving social cohesion and investment in the local economy. What the potential long-term consequences might be of these interventions, I don't think we know at this point, and that requires us to be vigilant and to be tracking. And it goes back to my point, we've got to be constantly monitoring, evaluating what these interventions produce, and to determine whether those outcomes are in fact responsive to the problems we identified at that time and place. And if they're not, being able to be flexible and nimble enough to be able to change. And that's why partnerships are so important. That ability to detect the need to change is often easier to determine if you've got other eyes looking at the problem. So again, no silver bullet there, I'm afraid. A follow-up question from Faith. Agreed. Do you know of other specific ways to measure progress on climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation at the local level? Any examples where it's been done by some city? I think the most obvious one, Faith, there in terms of climate change mitigation, that's a lot easier to do, because with mitigation, the big goal that we're all aiming for, obviously, is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And so we do have a standardized approach to cities reporting on their greenhouse gas emissions. So if you look at the cities that are part of the Global Compact of mayors, those cities are all reporting on the greenhouse gas emissions and the activities they've taken to reduce those emissions, and they're reporting on them using a standard methodology. So it's quite easy to, or more easy or easier to track progress, because you've got a standard methodology for measuring the greenhouse gas emissions. It's all reported in one place, and so one can do comparatives across that range of city interventions. Climate change adaptation is very difficult, and we experienced this difficulty with the work we did on the Durban Adaptation Charter, because with adaptation, you're not mitigation, which of greenhouse gas emissions, it's standard. It doesn't matter where you reduce carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and so on. With adaptation, it's extremely context specific. You know, it depends on the city, it depends on the needs of the people, it depends on the level of risk and how that risk varies across the urban population. So we found it very difficult to define standard metrics. So for example, if you go onto the Carbon Cities Registry, which is run by IPCC, and through which cities report, for example, on their mitigation initiatives, the adaptation initiatives, you'll see that the adaptation reporting is largely on process. So it's not on detailed interventions, because those tend to be specific to cities, but really around the process. You know, are you putting in place an adaptation plan? Are you forming partnerships? Are you focusing on community and ecosystem-based adaptation and so on? So those tend to be more process-oriented metrics, just simply because climate change adaptation is more context-specific than is mitigation. Satya Lakshmi, is there any immediate short-term solution to manage climate change effects? Not really. You know, it's a difficult set of challenges that we face. We're already facing very severe impacts from existing climate change. So we know from the work that's been done to date, we're sitting at a temperature increase of just over 1 degree Celsius over pre-industrial temperatures. And even at that level, we can already see the huge impact it's had on things like the Great Barrier Reef. And certainly a recent paper, for example, on the Great Barrier Reef posits the suggestion that it may not be possible to protect the biodiversity value of the Great Barrier Reef anymore, but that we will only be able to protect the delivery of ecosystem services. So it suggests that we've already crossed some key threshold points. So very hard to deal with those short-term impacts if they're involving a range of key thresholds. One reason we are doing a special report in the IPCC sixth assessment cycle is that we know that the oceans are probably a system in which some of these early threshold points are going to be triggered. And that's quite worrying for us, because if you think about the number of people who live in the coastal zone around the world, anything that dramatically increases sea level rise or impacts on local fisheries is going to have a huge impact at the global level. And that's already occurring at levels of climate change that are built into the system that is very hard to reverse. So really the only way to deal with this going forward is ambitious mitigation, but we also know that there are potential consequences of ambitious mitigation. So if we try and move from fossil fuels, for example, to bioenergy, that may compromise food security. So again, a very tough situation. Obviously, the message that comes to us from the Paris Agreement is we've got to have mitigation that's at least ambitious enough to keep us to a 2-degree level of increase. That requires us to leave all the fossil fuels pretty much in the ground and to move with increasing vigor to renewable energy. But we've got to be careful about those renewable forms of energy to determine if there are other impacts. And obviously, we've got to start reducing elements of risk. So we've got to put in place adaptation to existing changes. In Africa, we believe that requires very strongly working with existing ecosystems to take some of the risk out of the system. I've been told, my last question from Shwari George, would it be right to say that maybe by 2030, given the rate of change in developing countries, the idea of rural will become obsolete? Cities would have penetrated almost all rural areas. The divisions then might just be urban and ultra-urban. Cities and megacities, there would be a paradigm shift in the way we look at inhabiting the earth. Shawari, I absolutely agree with you. I've just read a prediction that Dhaka in Bangladesh could have 80 million people. It's not essential that it's ultra urban. It's something beyond that, and certainly even in Africa, which is the most rural of the continents, what we are seeing is a very strong move into the arenas, and certainly by 2030, over half of Africans will be living in cities. So I think we are beginning to see a very strong urbanization. I think the rural population, we know, will eventually decrease, and this puts urban at center stage. And you're quite correct. I think changes the discourse around cities, because cities are going to evolve, and I think we will have a spectrum from ultra-urban all the way through to the small town. I've just been notified that that's it. And really just to close out and think about what you should take from this. You know, if I leave you with any key message today, if you are a local researcher, a local government official, a local level activist, know that you've got huge responsibility on your shoulders, because those SDGs, the Paris Agreement, the New Urban Agenda, are all going to fall into your lap for you to translate into local action. And picking up on the last point, you know, that action is going to be focused in cities of the world, and we're going to have to figure out what that means for the future of cities. I think we face, by the end of the century, a very different set of possibilities for what cities might be, their scale, and what they might look like. But it's going to require each of us to be brave, to be inventive, and so I urge you to pick up on the challenge. That's it from me, and thanks very much for your time. I hope that was interesting, and looking forward to meeting many of you in the global meetings I attend. Thanks very much.